fourth part has the following factors: willingness to communicate, inhibition, and risk-taking. Willingness to communicate. This particular factor leads us to refers to the intention to initiate communication given a choice. So it is the willingness, a desire to communicate as far as the second language is concerned. So desire and willingness to communicate with the speaker of the second language culture or the target language speaker, you can say. In second language acquisition, willingness to communicate refers to the idea that language learners who are willing to communicate, they look for or they seek opportunities or chances where they can communicate. And not only that, once they are given an opportunity or once they are given the chances, they also carry out this desire and they perform communicative acts. So willingness to communicate is not only restricted to one's desire or readiness, but also the actual implementation of that desire or actual act, which is speech act or communicative act that he or she carries out or performs in a given situation. To understand the willingness to communicate, the pyramid model has been established that describes learners' use of second language. As the learner moves up the pyramid, the learner has more control over the act of communicating in the target language. The model has 6 layers, and from top to bottom, they are communication behavior, behavioral intentions, situated antecedents, motivational propensities, affective cognitive context, and social and individual context. It states that layers 6, 5, and 4 are considered to be having lasting influences. At layer 3, 2, and 1, the influences on actual second language use is basically in a given situation. These 3 have the long-lasting influences on the second language use, and these 3 layers have their influences when you have a given situation. So layer 3, 2, 1 are basically considered to have the influences when it is being used at a given time and not always. Whereas layer 6, 5, and 4, they have long-lasting influences. If we look at layer 6, you have the social and individual context where you have personality and intergroup climate. Effective cognitive context is your communicative competency, social situation, and intergroup attitude. Then motivational propensities, which are the tendencies basically. You have the self-confidence, intergroup motivation, interpersonal, and situation or situated antecedent is the state of communication or your desire. Then you move up to the willingness or readiness to communicate, and then this willingness will take you to the actual use of second language for communication purposes. Now we have inhibition. It's a feeling that makes oneself conscious and unable to act in a relaxed and natural way. So inhibition is something or a feeling which stops you or hinders your process of any learning process or any developmental process as far as language learning is concerned. Person feels discomfort and uneasiness and not relaxed in a given situation. Set of defenses all human beings built to protect the ego. And what do we mean by ego over here is the language ego, which is very personal, egoistic nature of second language acquisition process. When somebody is in the process of acquiring the second language, he or she is bound to feel apprehensive that his language use might not be ridiculed or may not be considered as incorrect. And therefore, in order to protect himself, he or she develops set of defenses. And those defenses basically are what we call the states of inhibition. Brown feels that language learning implies great deal of self-exposure as it necessarily involves making mistakes. So when you are in a process of second language acquisition, one is bound to make mistakes. And then when somebody is making mistakes, he or she becomes very conscious of the fact and tries to build up those defense which blocks or hinders the language learning process. Al Stevens says that alienation arises from the defenses. Your isolation or your withdrawal basically is the result of those defenses, and inhibit learning, and their removal can therefore promote language learning. So if all the inhibitions are removed, all the barriers are removed, learner is in a better condition to develop the language learning process. So inhibition basically comes from low self-esteem. Low self-esteem is something which is reflected because of one's uncertainty, one's disbelief, one's lack of confidence in oneself, and that can lead to strong inhibition. One is going through a feeling of inhibition, will be afraid to make mistakes, and then language learning will become difficult because making mistake is a natural phenomena. One has to go through this process. So if low self-esteem will generate strong inhibition, it will result into not being able to make mistake or apprehension or fear of making mistakes, and this will result into difficult language learning. Now, high self-esteem, that you have faith and you know there's a sense of self-efficacy, of strong self-esteem. Weak inhibition. A person who has high self-esteem will not feel inhibition, will be confident to open up to the speakers of target language, and this will result into positive language learning. So low self-esteem will result into strong inhibitions, and high self-esteem will result into weak inhibitions. And for successful language learning, we need weak inhibition or none of them at all. Risk-taking. Linguists define risk-taking as an ability of being eager to try out new information intelligently without having any fear of embarrassment. According to Brown, interaction requires the risk of failing to produce intended meaning, of failing to interpret intended meaning, of being laughed at, of being shunned or rejected. The rewards, of course, are great and worth the risk. So Brown has combined all different types of possibilities of failures that one ponder or one determines before actually taking a risk. But once the risks are taken, they are worth it. The reward that they get at the end, it's worth taking the risk. According to Brown, the key to risk-taking as a peak performance strategy is not simply in taking the risk. It is learning from your own behavior. So with regard to risk-taking, it's not about how you are motivating yourself to try out something which is new or challenging. It is that how, by taking a risk, even if you fail to come up with the desired outcome, it is what you have learned from that process of taking risk. And as you can see from this image, yes, risk-taking is inherently failure-prone. The chances of being failure or will not be able to meet the desired outcome are there. The possibilities are there, and that is why it is risk-taking and not sure-thing-taking trait. To conclude, personality traits that affect usage of language learning strategies are anxiety, self-esteem, extroversion and introversion, willingness to communicate, empathy, inhibition, and risk-taking. These are the effective factors that affect your second language learning process.